Good morning. Welcome, everyone, to the Sunday morning uh, um, program, ICSS Sunday Marxist Program. Um, Today, our speaker is Allan Miller. Um, he, along with me, are members of the Planning Committee, and there are 8 members, and you're familiar with our format. Uh, So today's session starting late, so I'll be very brief in the introduction, but I should introduce Allan. Allan has a PhD in economics from University of California in Riverside. He comes from a working class family. He's worked on the shop as an industrial worker, and he struggled for social justice all his life. And he's going to speak today. His topic is Workers in the Crosshairs, the US trade war, tariffs, and globalization. He's going to speak for 45 minutes to an hour, followed by announcements, and then we'll have question answers. Our program will end at 12:30. This program is on Zoom. It'll be recorded. It is being recorded. I should let you know. It'll be on YouTube a little later. So without losing further time in introduction, your floor, Allan. Go ahead.
Thank you. Okay, a lot going on right now. And a big question is, how do we get where we are today? So we'll start off by talking 43 years ago, just after the fall of the Soviet Union, the triumphalist US capitalist class proclaimed the end of history. Today, history is reasserting itself. We've had five decades of bipartisan austerity, endless wars, globalization, deindustrialization, parasitic financial speculation, all of which has left the US in a shambles and working people in the US in dire straits. In response to this, along comes the newly minted 21st century, quote unquote, MAGA capitalism to the rescue, which we're told will bring us back to the good old days of post-war US capitalism. So the question is, how are we going to get there? Through tariffs and dodge. What's the alternative? Going back to the make-believe world of the Democratic Party status quo, which really just says if we could only get rid of the orange monster, everything will be fine. Today, we're going to talk about how we have gotten here, where this will take us in the hope of sparking discussion about ideas about what is to be done. So with that, you guys see my screen? Okay, Raj?
Yes.
Advancing?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
good. All right. So let's turn the clock back to after World War II. And this historical background is really key to understanding what's going on today. At the end of World War II, the US emerged unscathed, producing 35% of the entire world's industrial output. US exports dominated world trade, and the US became the world's creditor nation. The US dollar became the international reserve currency, which was used for all international trade. What ended up happening in the 1970s to 1980s was increased foreign competition, especially from Japan and secondarily from Germany. You also had falling profitability on domestic manufacturing. What this led to was offshoring and automation in the domestic economy here in the US, which has been referred to as globalization. And if you look at what happened in the US economy in terms of international trade, we started running chronic balance of trade deficits in the early 1970s. And this plot represents the trend of balance of trade. This is exports minus imports. And you can see that trade was balanced. In fact, it was largely balanced from the end of the war up until the early 70s. And then suddenly in the early 70s, chronic trade deficits started to occur. And gradually more and more and more, all the way up through today, every year, consistently, the US has been running balance of trade deficits. Just a side note for you to, just a side note for your information, the trade deficit is overall in both goods and services, but in fact, we'll come back to this later, the real deficit is in goods trade, physical commodities, and the US is actually running a balance of trade surplus in services. So goods, manufactured goods in particular, are the things that are driving this deficit. If you look at the situation today, 2024, the United States is running $918 billion balance of trade deficit, almost $1 trillion. In other words, we are importing more than we are exporting by close to $1 trillion, 2024. Normally, what happens when a country runs a chronic balance of trade deficit? Well, what you have is a devaluation of the importing country's currency, which would be the US dollar, and appreciation of the exporting country's currency, so the countries that we're buying from. What this would do is it would reduce imports and boost exports from the deficit economy, in the case of the US, and bring international trade back into balance. We can talk about this more later, explaining what it is, but basically you have to buy dollars in order, countries have to buy dollars in order to export, and we buy their currencies in order to import. Well, why didn't this balancing based on currency adjustments take place? Because the US, since World War II, has been the dollar has been the international trading and reserve currency. In other words, the US can simply print money, quote unquote, create money to pay for imports and float IOUs in the form of treasury bonds that are bought by countries that we import from to finance those imports and to finance US government operations, which we'll talk about in a moment. And in fact, if you look at this trend starting from the 1970s of chronic balance of trade deficits, you also have in place a very large and costly infrastructure that's used to support this global trading system. Of course, you have this massive amount of military spending with military bases all over the world, 700 to 800 military bases. You have a large political and cultural infrastructure, such as the USAID and the National Endowment for Democracy, which is used to create the political conditions for this system that the US dominates in the international system. I'll call your attention to the National Endowment for Democracy, something I didn't realize, but this is the original logo for the NED. And this is the new logo, which was just adopted within the last year or two. So take a look at the difference between the two. Maybe people can comment on that. In addition to that, we've also had ballooning US federal deficits. If you look at this today, you can see that the US today is running the largest federal deficits. In other words, the government is spending more than it's taking in revenue at any time since, with the exception of the COVID years, it's a growing trend. Deficits have been exploding. It's gotten to the point now where the US is spending more than $2 billion a day in interest payments alone on a debt that is so large that it equates to $106,000 for every US citizen. We have a $1.8 trillion deficit and a $36 trillion debt. What this is coming down to now is that we have a $1 trillion annual interest payment, and it's growing. And this is the fastest part of the ballooning debt is the fastest growing part of the national budget. Offshoring, this movement of production from the United States overseas to low-wage centers has led to deindustrialization of the United States, where vast swaths of the country we all know referred to as the Dust Belt, manufacturing has basically moved overseas and people are out of work. As a result of the decline in manufacturing jobs, you have lower wages, poor benefits for working people. If you look at this, the share of manufacturing employment in the US went from about 33% in 1947 at its high, down to today about 7 or 8%. So it's a very small part of the economy. And if you look at this, corresponding to this, union membership has dropped from 35% in the 1950s to 7% in 2020. So its union membership has also sunk. As a result of this, we've had a shift from high-paid, relatively high-paying manufacturing jobs with decent benefits to low-wage, casual jobs. And over the past 3 decades, the US economy has created more low-quality jobs than high-quality jobs. In fact, I was looking at a statistic just this morning that there are now 9 million people in the workforce, 9 million Americans who are working multiple jobs. This is the largest number ever, 9 million out of a workforce of about 160 plus million. We've also had, coming out of the war, we had rising real wages, and then real wages starting at about exactly this time when the chronic trade deficits and outsourcing, offshoring started to take place, real wages started to freeze. And today, real wages are flat, if not declining. So we had a dramatic increase from 1940 to 1970 and a leveling out and decline after 1970. What this has done in American society is it's had a devastating impact. And I don't have time to go into it. I know I've got like a bunch of images on here. But if you look at really what's taken place, it's been a catastrophe for the US. People are buried in debt. The cost of healthcare services has gone up. Medical bankruptcies, food prices, housing, education cost, transportation, private ownership of cars, public transit. The infrastructure of the US is decaying rapidly. And we have a rapid rise in inequality and homelessness. All of these factors have been operating. It's taking a toll on the working population, especially among young people. What did this lead to? This is the big question where we're kind of getting into today. It has led to the election of Donald Trump and the rise of nationalist populism and the demise of the Democratic Party. Now, let's bring this onto the topic of today. What is Trump's solution to this problem? Well, a big part of it is what he explained on Liberation Day with his executive order. And I'm going to go through in the next part of the presentation, I want to go through a detailed explanation of what Trump's team is talking about when they say, what is the nature of the problem and how is it going to be solved? And I'll just start with a quote from his Liberation Day get-together, where he said, large and persistent trade deficits constitute an unusual and extraordinary threat to the personal security and economy of the United States. These deficits have led to, number one, hollowing out of our manufacturing base, deindustrialization. Number two, it's inhibited the advancement of our domestic manufacturing capabilities. In other words, we're losing on technology. Number three, it's undermined critical supply chains, which means that we have production dependence on foreign countries, especially China, for us to produce what we do produce. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, in his view, it's undermined our defense industrial base. It's caused a military industrial crisis. Now, what's the thinking behind this? I think that if you really want to look into this, it's most valuable to look into the writings of the chairman of the committee of the government CEA, the chief economic advisor, Stephen Miron. And he gave a talk at Hudson Bay. This is a hedge fund that he's associated with, and this is the YouTube address of the talk, in which he talks about what's the problem today and what the Trump administration intends to do about it. He's the chair of the Council of Economic Advisors. And he starts off by saying, essentially, the United States has been supplying, essentially free of charge, security services or military protection for allies, and the use of the dollar as the international reserve currency for the entire world, which makes possible the global trading system and the global financial system. And that the US has been subject to unfair trading practices. So what Miron is saying is that we've been providing all of these services to the world free of charge, and we're running trade deficits because of unfair trading practices on the part of our partners. And President Trump, as he said, has made it clear that we will no longer stand for other nations free riding on our blood, sweat, and tears, whether in national security or trade. So basically, he's saying we're gonna pick up the fight over this situation. Now, Miron actually wrote an article before he was appointed to the CEA called How to Build America Right. I'm going to go through this. I'm going to apologize ahead of time because there's a lot of quotes from the article here, but I think it's really important for everybody to understand what they have in mind in terms of their policies and what they see as the criticism of the policies of the past, in particular the Biden administration and even the Republican administrations from the past. So how to build America right. Well, the first thing that he cites here is the military-industrial imperative. The hot wars in Ukraine and Israel have made national security argument for reindustrializing the American economy more credible. Securing domestic production of war material and other goods requires that the United States decouple defense supply chains from China and scrap policies that benefit Beijing at our expense. So the first thing of concern is deindustrialization has harmed the U.S. in terms of its capability to produce military industrial products to fight wars. In the past, reindustrialization can be done either the right way or the wrong way. And what he's saying is that Bidenomics represented the approach which was the wrong way, which was subsidizing unprofitable investment. So what he's talking about in particular, he cites electric vehicles, solar, and other products that lack what he called durable consumer demand. And what happened is that the government rushed in and provided subsidies to EV production. Guess who was a major benefit of that? The Tesla Corporation and Elon Musk, which were estimated at about $50,000 per vehicle to support production. He's saying that if these products really were genuine products that reflected a long-term, consumer demand, that we wouldn't have to subsidize them. Basically, what's happening is that Bidenomics structurally impedes the efficient utilization of resources, hampering the supply side. It raises the cost of domestic production through lavish taxpayer subsidies. And he compares this to countries like China that use quote unquote industrial policy to make their products cheaper and gain export share. And what this has done is it's really contributed to the problem of our burgeoning debt, and it's really not a viable solution to the problems that we're having. What's the right way to industrialize? Aggressive supply side reforms. What we need to do is we need to relax and streamline rules. We make them, and we need to, for example, get rid of regulatory laws for health and safety. So, for example, he was saying that there is a regulatory regime for air pollutants and semiconductor plants. And this industry-specific regulatory framework, what it does is it makes chip manufacturing more expensive here at home, and that's why we've lost it. Another telling part of this is that we should repeal legislation that drives up the cost of doing business at home. For example, the Davis-Bacon Act, which what it does is it forces non-union firms to pay above market rates, which effectively discourages them from using American labor. So when we're subsidizing semiconductor production, anybody that's brought in has to be paid at a union rate. We've got to get rid of this if we want to unleash and successfully reindustrialize. And finally, the thing that he really is emphasizing is that China is our core security threat. And this is really a key part of the narrative that the Trump administration is pushing. Successful reindustrialization will require Americans to acknowledge that China is our core security threat, that with geopolitical tensions intensifying, reindustrialization is a national security imperative. Now, why all this focus on China? Well, China has really risen to become one of the world's major manufacturing centers. This is an interesting graphic here. Global share of manufacturing output today produced in China is about 30%. So it's pretty much the same as it was for the US at its height just after World War II. And China's share of world gross domestic product, in other words, everything that's produced, rose from 2.7% in 1980 to approximately 19.6% in 2024. China is the world's manufacturing superpower. Again, if this is the share of global manufacturing in 2023, 28.9, it's gone up to about 30%. And if you look at this is I found this plot to be really quite informative, because it shows that the United States is at about 17%. Then you have Japan and Germany, 5%. Then you have some smaller percentages by these different countries, Brazil, France, Italy, between 2 and 5%. China is also a major consumer of global commodities. If you look at this, China uses over 40% of all of these commodities, from coal down to iron ore, copper, etc., and is also a major user of these other industrial commodities. I think China accounts today for about 40% of total commodity consumption in the world today in their manufacturing system. Now, this is the threat that's posed to American capitalism. How do we get the working class on board to meet this threat? Well, the answer is that we sell tariffs for MAGA reindustrialization. We're going to make America great again. We're going to return back to the 1950s and 1960s when we had an industrialized country. And the working class is going to be the greatest benefits of this. Now, I want to call your attention to this interview that Tucker Carlson did with Robert Lighthizer, who is the U.S. Trade Representative. This is the URL for the interview. I strongly recommend listening to this. It's about an hour plus interview, but in it, Lighthizer, who comes from Ohio, from the Midwest, speaks eloquently and with a great deal of passion about the industrial decline of America. Exactly the same points that I was making in the earlier part of my presentation. And he talks about everything from the decline of well-paying manufacturing jobs, the social disintegration, the decline in the life expectancy of people in the US, so comprehensively and so passionately that he would make a great candidate speaker for a Sunday morning Marxist Forum to come on and talk about this. But the whole idea behind it is that a big part of the appeal that Trump is putting forward with MAGA reindustrialization is being aimed at the working class. And this is what he talked about throughout his campaign. This is what really MAGA, Make America Great Again, is all about. So while the Democrats were talking about domestic issues like, gender equality and things like that, or gender, neutral bathrooms. Trump was hammering the point about the decline of America, the deindustrialization, and really whipping up the targets of immigrants and foreign competition, for unfair foreign economic competition and trade, to try to get the working class on board, because you can't have a policy. The capitalist class can't have a policy in its interest unless it can bring the working class on board. So tariffs, this is a really key part of the program. And just a very quick kind of a basic introduction to tariffs. Tariffs are a tax. That's what they are. They're a tax on goods that are imported from other countries. They're typically charged as a percentage of the product's value. And the domestic businesses that import products, and this is everybody who imports products, right? Because businesses bring products into a country, they pay tariffs up front upon landing, and the money ends up in the US Treasury. When a tariff is charged, it's really what happens, who pays the tariff? Well, there's really three possibilities. It can be passed on to consumers of the imported product in the form of price increases, which is the most common case, so that if the electronics are charged a tariff, then the company that sells the imported product, domestic company, jacks up the price in order to pay the tariff. It can also be absorbed by the importing company as a cost of production, reducing their profit. So they can basically say, okay, we're going to eat all or part of the tax, only raise our price a little bit, and basically cut into our profits for the rest. Or it can be absorbed by the exporting company by reducing prices and thus reducing their profit. So when they come in, they're going to, instead of selling it at the price that they normally would, they reduce the price in order to reduce the tariff, in order to reduce the price of sale at the point of sale in the domestic economy. And very, very briefly, there's a lot of news coverage of this, but the Trump tax formula is basically an attempt to reduce the balance of trade deficits with trading countries. And it's calculated on the basis of taking the percentage that the deficit that we have at that country of our total imports from that country times 1/2. So the example that's used commonly is for Vietnam, has a $123 billion trade deficit and $137 billion in US imports. So it's about 90%. Their deficit of total imports, 45%, is cut in half. What this has done, well, what this would do as it's implemented is raise the average tariff rate on US imported goods to about 26%, to about 26. So applying that formula as it is would basically raise would raise tariffs, or would put in place tariffs that are equal to about a quarter of all the goods that come into the US, which, if you look at the historical trend here, this is tariffs from 1890 up until today, and you can see that tariffs basically have been pretty low. This brings us to the highest level in 130 years, since the late 19th century. So this is quite a shock. What's the impact of tariffs? What's going to be the impact? Well, you know something? There's been a lot of coverage of this in the news. In fact, if you look at the news, if you look at the mainstream capitalist media, it's been just overwhelmingly negative and quite ubiquitous, quite loud. So there are interviews with virtually every expert economist says that tariffs are going to be a disaster, that they're going to have a disastrous effect. There are news stories after news stories about tariff turmoil and, tariff natural disaster. And lately we started seeing news stories showing interviews with working people who voted for Trump and then lost their job as a result of tariffs, or about to lose their job as a result of tariffs. They interview them and they have regrets for having voted for Trump. Now, I'm not going to go into it because there's been so much coverage. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the economic impact. I just want to kind of summarize it and give you a picture, because I think everybody has either been watching this, hearing this, or if you want to, you can go outside to the mainstream and find all kinds of media that will analyze and explain this. And what we want to focus on here is this is a Marxist forum. We want to really talk about what the impact is from a Marxist perspective, as well as a perspective of the working class. But let me just run through a summary of what tariffs are likely to do. Well, obviously, it's going to spike inflation. Prices of imported consumer goods are going to go up. Prices for inputs, about 45% of manufacturing in the US is done using inputs from imported inputs, which raw materials for production and parts for production. And this is going to fuel inflation and all the machinery and equipment that we buy to produce. So prices will be going up. There are going to be supply shocks. This in China, which is the trade is particularly disrupted. We import $570 billion. About 40% are inputs for our own manufacturing sector. And if this is choked off, I mean, even the minimum, it was estimated at the very beginning when there was something like 34%, it would reduce imports by at least 20% from China, which is going to have a very significant impact on supply of inputs and production here in the US. And it could lead to supply shocks similar to the pandemic. There's also the question of retaliation. And just by way of comparison, in the 1930s, during the height of the Great Depression, the US passed the Smoot-Hawley Act, which is what basically Trump is using some of the provisions of it to raise tariffs, which led to a fall of 33% in US exports. And global trade, entire trade, fell from 3 billion in 1929 to 1 billion in 1933. So basically a reduction by 2/3 of the volume of trade as countries put retaliatory tariffs on each other. Today, trade is 3 times bigger share of US GDP, 15% than it was in 1929, which is 6%. So it would have a massive, it's going to have a massive impact. The estimated real GDP decline, different think tanks, businesses, et cetera, have been estimating this is somewhere between 1.5% and 2%. And it's going to be very disruptive to capital flows, investment, and growth worldwide in the capitalist economy. Now, in addition to this, well, let me just say that if you want to read about the impact of tariffs, I'd say go ahead, skip the mainstream media and just pick up a copy of a newspaper, go online and look at an article in many of the excellent left-wing socialist communist newspapers. So here's an example from Workers' World, an article that came out a couple of days ago. They basically gave a great summary that you can pick up in one place. They talked about the fact that there are 33.2 million small businesses that contribute 44% of the US gross net domestic product. So 33 million small businesses, almost half of the GDP. These businesses employ 61.6 million US workers. And these small businesses are the most vulnerable. They depend very heavily on imports. And many of them will go bankrupt, and many of these workers will lose their jobs. So in many ways, the tariff regime will cause a small business apocalypse. In addition to that, whoops, we're going to have massive job losses in the rest of industry. Oops, sorry. So Goldman Sachs report in mid-April estimated that about 100,000 new jobs would be added as a result of the tariffs that are going to be put in place, and a loss of another 500,000 jobs, which is a very large number of jobs. An analysis by the Yale Budget Lab estimated that tariffs would result in 740,000 people losing jobs across the US by the end of 2025. So big impact. Will the tariffs work? Highly unlikely, even with the unleashed, deregulated capitalist enterprises that Mirren is referring to, mainly because there are supply chain complexities. There needs to be a source of low-cost energy and high-quality 5G communications infrastructure to drive robotics and AI, which we're really lacking. You have to have a highly educated labor force, high level of literacy and numeracy, math skills in order to run a modern industrialized manufacturing economy. And there's a great deal of cost involved with the frictional readjustments of people getting laid off here and people getting employed there, even under the most wildly optimistic conditions. So it's very unlikely that this tariff-based, deregulated capitalism, free, quote unquote, free trade, free enterprise approach to restoring the manufacturing base is going to work. In particular, we really have to look at China and what is the role now. We know that there's this huge, China is really at the center of the conflict in this trade war. And to sort of see how it's going to have an effect, let's just look at this. China today is a massive commercial superpower. Their imports and exports are at the level of the United States, right? That China is the principal trading partner for 150 countries in the world today. So the majority of countries, China is their principal trading partner. China has moved way up in the value chain. In other words, they're producing products that are much higher technology products, not just lower technology products that they're producing sort of cutting edge, expensive, high technology products such as in shipbuilding, solar, electric vehicles, and robotics. And in addition to that, the Chinese account for about 90% of rare earth production, rare earth minerals production. And these rare earth minerals are minerals that are used throughout the manufacturing process, in particular in high tech and in phones and computers and data storage devices, the information infrastructure that are absolutely essential. And the Chinese, in response to slapping these wild tariffs on Chinese exports to the U.S., have suspended exports of rare earth minerals to the U.S., which in and of itself is going to have a tremendous impact. I found this cartoon to be really kind of amusing. You know, it really shows that Trump has been all over the place on tariffs. You know, 34%, 84, 125, 105, 200. We're going to show that we're tough. And all of this kind of bloviating that Trump has been engaged in, and then reversing himself very quickly, showing that the Chinese basically have been relatively unfazed in response. That in fact, what's happening is that the U.S. is attempting to throw its weight around, but is really no longer the superpower economically that it once was. And in many ways, it's sort of it's almost like a comedy show in terms of what they're trying to do in relation to China. In addition to this, you have a new emerging economic order consisting of the BRICS countries. Now, this includes China, but these countries also that are part of BRICS represent a very large part of the total GDP that's produced in the world today. Obviously, China at 30% is the largest share, but you still have rising countries that are part of it, India, Russia, South Africa, etc., that it represents sort of like an emerging order that represent an alternative to US trade. And then finally, you have what's happened in Ukraine, which has been this ongoing more than 3-year long war of attrition that's taken place between NATO and Russia on Ukrainian soil. And one of the impacts of this war in Ukraine has been to reveal the military-industrial crisis of the Western capitalist world. In other words, this is just one article that I pulled. America's war machine can't make basic artillery fast enough. Talking about the fact that ground wars are still won with bullets and artillery shells. The US can't make the latter fast enough, and they're in perilously short supply. So one of the reasons why Russia has been able to succeed in their military campaign is that they're outproducing not the United States, but NATO in the area, for example, of artillery shells by a factor of 10 to 1, which it means that it will take years for them to catch up, even if they reach the same level of production. And this is a multifaceted, deep military industrial crisis. It's not just artillery shells, it's missiles, it's armored vehicles, it's drones and things like that. All this has really shifted. The United States is really, and the G7 countries really are at on the losing end of this fight. Now, what are people saying that? Now, at the beginning of the talk, I talked about the fact that really there are two roads that have been taken. One of them has been the road of globalization, or we'll call it the liberal globalist road, where we've had outsourcing and deindustrialization, etc. And I spent the first third of the presentation talking about the catastrophe that has caused. The other side is the Trump approach, which I've been talking about for the second part of the talk, which is also likely to be an unmitigated disaster and completely unsuccessful. Well, what are the liberal globalists saying about the Trump program? Well, they're emphasizing the disruptions to the international trading system, the uncertainty that it's creating in the business environment and the impact of that. They're saying that trade and business imbalances are inconsequential. Paul Krugman published an article last June in the New York Times where he said, hey, we've been running deficits since World War II, and many countries have been running deficits, a larger percentage of their GDP. So the balance of the government budget debt is something that we really shouldn't be worried about because it'll all work itself out, even though it's getting to the point of $1 trillion a year. One of the things, by the way, that Krugman noted, the reason why you won't go bankrupt if you are running these persistent deficits is because as the country that controls the reserve currency, we can always print more money to finance our deficits. And this is exactly this structure where we are selling treasury bonds to foreign countries in order to finance our ballooning government deficits is being undermined by the actions of the U.S. in the recent period and the Trump policies that are coming into place. So he's taking that for granted. And basically what these the New York Times and these other sort of Democratic Party centered publications and media are saying is that everything was fine before Trump's insane, irrational disruptions. Now, I just want to focus very briefly, again, just a little more detail on what is the solution that this kind of liberal response is providing. There was a very interesting article, an opinion article in the Wall Street Journal just about a month ago, which was commenting on Trump's policies. Tariffs won't bring a boom to American manufacturing, but tax credits, subsidized loans, and grants could boost U.S. production of energy and some products. So this was put forward, published in the Wall Street Journal, the center of the capitalist press in the U.S., by Jared Bernstein, who was the CEA chairman under, I believe, is either Biden or Obama administration, and Dean Baker, one of the flagship quote unquote progressive economists in the US from the Center for CEPR, and publishes in Counterpunch. He republishes articles regularly. They're saying that tariffs won't, this is the solution that they're saying, tariffs won't do it, but tax credits, subsidized loans, and grants could boost US production of energy and some products. And what they're saying here is that the historical record is clear about two things: that spurring domestic investments isn't only possible, it's already happening. In other words, reindustrialization is on its way. It's supported by tax credits, subsidized loans, and grants from the Inflation Reduction Act, the CHIPS Act, and the bipartisan infrastructure law. Factory construction more than doubled from 2019 to 2024. So we were on our way, quote unquote, to reindustrializing through grants and subsidized loans. Let's take a look at this. This would be a great 1 hour, a full session in on a Sunday morning Marxist. So if we look at this, one of the things that they cite is the US CHIPS Act. And there was an article in Financial Times, which is sort of British-based, the paper or the publication for the world capitalist class. And they said, US CHIPS Act fails to achieve the industrial revolution planned by the Biden administration. 40% of investments reportedly delayed or halted. So 40% of the projects that were financed in the CHIPS Act, and I want to focus on one of them. There was one project that was part of the CHIPS Act, which was to bring semiconductor manufacturing back to the US. And what they did was they gave a loan that was, they had $6.6 billion in direct funding and $5 billion in low-cost loans to build a chip foundry, a production factory in Arizona. And the project, which had 3 phases, was expected to create around 6,000 well-paid jobs. So a total subsidy of about $12 billion was expected to generate 6,000 well-paid jobs. And if you look at this, I mean, it was really a fiasco. TSMC, a Taiwanese company, brought in 50% of their employees for this factory in Arizona from Taiwan. And they say, well, we are going to hire more workers over time, 6,000 total. That's the optimistic guess. But about half of the 2,200 employees at TSMC's plant in Arizona came from Taiwan. Basically, what they had to do is they had to bring over people because the workforce here was not prepared to do the jobs that were necessary in order to complete the factory. So it's a project that is expensive. It's a project that is faltering. And it's a project that really isn't going to provide much benefit. So this idea of providing almost $12 billion in subsidies and trade really shows that this is the kind of thing that really doesn't work. You can't entice capitalist enterprises to produce. Now, what is the political situation in the US today? Well, if you look at it, capitalist politics in the US today what is the show that's taking place? Well, the first is the zombie horror film of Biden and Harris, and this was really, is this the type of leadership that we can have that's going to actually solve this historically monumental problem that we have? Well, no. So now we've got the reality game show host, Donald Trump, who's basically a blowhard xenophobe, just putting on a show to keep the show going. And lately we've had this fantasy superhero miniseries, Fighting Oligarchy, starring AOC and Bernie Sanders. And they're running a nationwide campaign that is attracting lots of people who are really fed up with this garbage that's been taking place with in the Trump administration. But whereas in the DNC back in the summer, they were extolling oligarchs, here they're in this superhero miniseries, they're fighting the oligarchy. So I'm coming to a conclusion here. Really, what are we talking about in terms of the problems that we're facing? How is it that we can address the problems that I described in the early part of this presentation, which are very real and very significant? Well, the answer is that the partial success of tariffs and industrial policy and in driving industrialization is limited to very rare and very specific historical situations. These conditions are not present in the US today. In other words, the type of expensive, ineffective industrial policy on the part of the Democrats, which is designed to entice the capitalist horse to drink from the trough, is not going to succeed. And the approach of using tariffs to shield and tariffs and dodge and so forth and deregulation to unleash capitalist enterprise is also not going to succeed. So neither tariffs, grants, or loans used as incentives given to profit-making monopoly capitalist enterprises can reverse the type and scale of economic decline that we're facing. And let me just say one last word on this. I'm almost done. But it's very clear, two things are very clear about capitalism. And this is reality. This is not rhetoric. Number one, capitalism, wherever it exists, from the time when it first existed on a worldwide scale in the early part of the 19th century, always runs into barriers involved with the structure of its production, what Marxists call the social relations of production. So capitalism necessarily, if left to itself, generates crisis. It's a barrier. This is what Marx talked about in his analysis of capitalism in Das Kapital. And number two, and this is really the more subtle point, because the first point is just it's like a duh type of point, is that capitalist industrialization takes place only under the rarest and most specific historical situations. In the case of the US, it was based upon the slave system. It was based upon the expansion of the country to the West, bringing in immigrants from Asia, the Chinese to build the railroads, the Europeans and Eastern Europeans to work in the factories in the early 20th century. There were tariffs that were used to provide some protection of domestic US industry during that period, but they really, even the historical analysis shows that they had very limited effect. It was really the sort of early stage capitalism that really took off in that period, with a very large and available low wage workforce. And those conditions are just not present in the US today. Those kinds of conditions only occur very, very occasionally under very definite and specific historical conditions. The only other alternative is socialist or industrialization, where you have an economy where the productive capacity of the economy, the means of production are owned and controlled by the working population, the working class, and that a planned economic system, that the production is organized on the basis of an economic plan. And this is the type of solution that has been shown to work and is also necessary today in the US in order for us to overcome the situation that we're in today. And this is exactly what happened in the Soviet Union starting in the 1920s. It also has happened in China, starting with the Chinese Revolution after 1949. And these are the best examples of how we can industrialize under socialism in the world today. So where do we go from here? Well, I just want to recommend a couple of books to read. I want to launch the discussion. We can even talk about it some today, although it's really not this is not the topic of today's discussion. But what is it that we should be doing? Well, one of the things is the answers lie in Marx's Capital, where he provided an analysis of the nature of the capitalist system that was a breakthrough in the science of political economy in the 19th century, just like there were breakthroughs in electricity and chemistry and physics. Marx analyzed, we got to a point in history where Marx was able to analyze the inner workings and the dynamics of capitalism. And I also want to call your attention to Lenin's book, What is to be Done, written in 1902, I believe it was, where he talked about the Russian movement and the Russian conditions and what was needed in order to achieve a successful revolution in Russia. Now, we're not saying that the conditions are exactly the same, but a lot of the lessons of what working people need to do in order to succeed you can start by looking at this book. And we really need discussion of this topic. That's the problem. We've got to start talking about what sort of politics we need, what sort of program, what sort of transitional program, and to really put it in the scope of a workers' party and a communist parties to lead the struggle. So that's basically it for my presentation. I'm sorry for the late start, and we'll go from here. So Mehmet, you didn't have to cut me off.
Okay. All right. So, well, thank you, Comrade Dr. Allan Miller.
Doctor.
Yes, your PhD did a fine job today for you to make the presentation. I'm very excited at what you did, and I'm sure our people here attending would have lots of points to discuss with you. But first, some announcements. So what's happening next week, that comes first, and that is Bauman Azad will speak on next Sunday. It's the imminent U.S. war on Iran. That's the title. He's a chairman of the Peace Council, U.S. Peace Council, and he will be speaking on this highly tense situation with U.S. and Iran, which are now in negotiations. So that's next Sunday, and we will be announcing next Sunday the following programs. So at this point, what I like to do is to make an appeal that we do need some funds to run this program, and you can contribute. Either best way to contribute would be to write a check, and but there are other ways. You can use Buy Me a Coffee, and in the chat we will put in the address where you can send the checks. And we do need the funds, so we hope that you will make funds, and if you can make them on monthly basis so that it automatically gets done, that would be very helpful, because technical support requires us to pay them, and a lot of labor is donated, but we do need funds. So we We appreciate that you're doing it. So having said that, I think we can go into now into questions and comments period. Each person, I will try and follow in the sequence. I see them on the screen coming. But if you're not the first one, I mean, if I don't go in the sequence, please don't get upset. I will get to everybody, and we'll get to everybody in the first round before we go to the second round. The limit is 2 minutes for each participants. And Mehmet, please keep timing, and 15 seconds before 2 minutes are over, let them know. We'll let you finish your sentence, but don't get into a big lecture so that we can have a lot of question answers here. Everybody can participate. Having said that, I will go to first person is Lucy Rios on my screen, and then Richard Wright would be number 2.
I'd like to interrupt for just a moment.
Yes, go ahead, Roger, please.
Next week's program will not be Bahman Azad. Next week, May 4th, the Sunday morning at the Marxist Library, we're very happy to be hosting 2 people, Jerry Condon, and he will be in conversation with a true hero of the peace movement, Brian Wilson, a person who, as many of you know, probably lost his legs in the Concord Naval Weapons Station. And that will commemorate the 50th anniversary of the victory of the Vietnam victory over U.S. imperialism. And that'll be a very important commemoration. The following week, we will have Bahman Azad, who will be speaking on the developments within West Asia. So, and that is on our website, the ics.marx.org, and we invite you to look at our website.
Thank you for that correction, Roger. I misread the dates. So, okay, very good. So we'll go into question and comments. First person is Lucy Rios. Lucy, please go ahead.
Yeah, what I wanted to ask about, first I was so amazed. This was very good presentation, Alan. I really enjoyed it. And even me and Richard stayed awake throughout it. I managed to keep my eyes open. But yeah, no, the question I have is, suppose we were to make a call for the end of the dollar as the monetary system for the world, and return the dollar to just our own inside of it. What would happen? And could you walk us through what would happen to other things? Like, for instance, can we stop the military financing of the military as a result of that? And let's just suppose that we were able to get that somebody who could put that into action. Not Donald Trump, of course, but that we could make it a call that the people would support removing the dollar from
as a reserve currency.
there you go. Yeah.
You know, it's not a policy. It's really a historic outcome of World War II that this monetary system was put into place. And in fact, as a country, quote unquote, tremendous benefit occurs to the capitalist class as a result of having the dollar being used as the international reserve or trading currency. Because what happens is that when we import all of this stuff, people buy treasury bond, they get dollars and they buy treasury bonds, which sends not people, but the elites in foreign countries, in Japan, China, and other countries send their dollars back by buying treasury bonds, and that's what's used to finance government operations. Okay, as well as to be able to pay for the imports that we're bringing in. So it's been estimated that if the dollar loses its position, there was a study, we talked about this at a program last year, that it would be something like a 52% decrease in income in the United States, domestic income on the part of the population. So it's not something, let's say, well, let's pull the dollar in order to sort of pull the plug on the military. It's more like the position of the dollar is the basis that allows the imperialist military system to exist, and it's being undermined by these other forces of the U.S. slipping in its position for international trade. I didn't cover it in my talk because I didn't have time, but all of these things that are going on now as a result of the tariff disruptions are putting a lot of pressure on people to move out of the dollar into other types of assets, gold and so forth. And it's shaky enough that that's actually been part of the reason why Trump has been getting so much pressure to back off. So my short answer would be, we don't really, this is sort of the business of the capitalists. It's the business of business, and it's the system that's in place, and it's being undermined by its own dynamics. And even though it supports the military, it's not something that we demand, well, let's stop using the dollar as an internet. Our goal should be to fight the military spending itself. That's my take on it.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Richard Wright is next, followed by Mehmet.
So should we address you as Herr Comrade Doctor? Or
You can just call me Allan. Okay.
Okay. I one of the problems, or I had several things about your talk. I thought it was a really good talk, by the way. It was it was a good synopsis. One of the problems I had with it, and I hope you take this as a critical, constructive criticism, if you will, is that it lacked. You talked about the economic side of things. What you didn't talk about was the political side of things, and what you didn't talk about is the historic nature of the bourgeoisie in this country, and their influence on governmental policy, and that's something that's been going on now for basically as long as I've been alive. I mean, we know that the bourgeois in this country have the bourgeois class in this country have been at war, in particular with the Russia, Soviet Union, before I was born. The same thing's true for China. In fact, large measure, it's the pivot to China that. So, anyway, could you maybe? I know in the time that you've got, I know this is kind of constrained, but could you maybe address the historic, the bourgeois, the political side of things? Thank you.
Well, first of all, I just want to make one thing clear, that nothing that I presented today did I learn when I was in graduate school for bourgeois economics. So this was something I had to sort of study on my own, which I think you can understand why. It's really hard for me to comment on the political side. One thing I will say that I left out, which is that I talked about the economic contention with China, and also the hot war in Ukraine. But this is really, what does economic contention lead to in under imperialism and the imperialist system? And it leads to war. And clearly, this is the kinds of things that I talked about are driving a lot of the military policy and the pivot of the Trump administration away from Ukraine and towards China. and an attempt to sort of choke off China, its supply chain initiatives and things like that. You know, Richard, one thing that is just really astonishing to me when you think about it, I think this crosses everybody's mind, is we live in this capitalist country. The polarization of wealth is just unimaginable. We have a government that, you know, the last election cycle, what was it, $14 billion spent. We have like a media that's controlled by 5 corporations. We have this monstrous number of think tanks that are churning out ideology and politics, pundits, MSNBC, et cetera, et cetera. And, you know, this is all like capitalism and capitalist politics. It's like a dirty word that nobody mentions. And this is really the political domination that we have in the system. And it's so difficult to really gain an understanding of what's going on. I mean, when I would go on and try and research some of these points, I could get 10 pages of links returned by Google Corporation that have nothing to do with what I'm trying to understand, but are all slanted towards bolstering ideas that support capitalism. So I think we'll have to get a historian maybe to answer your question more completely.
Okay, so Mehmet, you're next, followed by, I believe, Sharon Rose will be next after Mehmet.
Thank you. First of all, Alan, I think it was an excellent presentation, very concise and focused. So I really enjoyed that. Now, my question is that imperialism didn't occur by accident. Especially at the level that we have today. You know, all the imports, exports, and all that trading exchanges between the imperialist countries and the other countries were based on an unequal exchange, which meant that this type of a trade, this type of an exchange reproduced at each level both the dependency of the countries that traded with imperialism and also the economy and the accumulation of surplus value in the metropolitan countries, the imperialist countries. So there was a real nice plan, real nice game that was happening. So why at this time that something like this that the ruling classes allowed Trump to do is to go in and disrupt it? I mean, it was working perfectly. The dependent countries are at their place producing for the imperialist countries. The imperialist countries enjoying what they had, and it was going pretty well. One question related to why it happened at this time is that, do you think that not nation, not US, not France, not Britain, but imperialist class has emerged, and they look at the world as, hey, this front is won in this war. We won the war, so the entire world is in our hands. So who cares? Is that the attitude, or how do you see this step being taken at this level? Thank you.
Well, a couple of things. I think that what you described in terms of the U.S. or the imperialist relations with especially the global South is absolutely true, that a great deal of the prosperity that sections of the U.S. population have experienced, certainly the capitalist class, a very small layer, but even like a layer of the workers and professional class has sort of been based on the system that's provided tremendous advantage and benefits back to the U.S. imperialism. And this is the material basis for the political and ideological and cultural superstructure that we have in place in the US today. So whether it be the union representatives, what has been referred to as the labor aristocracy, the trade union leadership, they've sort of got their place and they're enjoying their benefits. Dean Baker, as an economist, he sort of found his niche by based on part of the superstructure. The superstructure in the US is just amazing, the imperialist superstructure. It's so vast, it's so developed. I mean, I think it's something that you've referred to as, quote unquote, the show that's being put on to the population. Now, the thing is that, could it keep going? Well, the answer is it isn't. It hasn't, and it isn't. And it's like, that's where we have to look at the specific historical conditions. This is something that's a little bit outside the scope of what I addressed specifically. But if you look at it, capitalism developed from competitive capitalism to imperialism in the 19th century. And you had, the major capitalist powers that fought with each other in 2 world wars. Then you had World War II, where the US emerged as just so dominant, as the leader of the capitalist bloc, because everybody else was destroyed. Then we had socialism, but then we also had these national liberation struggles in Africa and Asia and in Latin America. And so things have shifted. They're shifting, and what it's given rise to in today's situation is that the US has largely had its industrial base hollowed out. We have an economic system, folks. I didn't even talk about this, the type of parasitic, wild, bubble financial shenanigans that are going on. You can't even imagine. I mean, you have to be somebody that has to be your world in terms of what's going on with derivatives and things like that. Now, all of this stuff is sort of coming to a head. This is something that people like myself and many of you who have lived through the stable post-war period of US dominance, it's hard for us to even imagine what the world is going towards at this point in terms of the crisis that we're encountering. And it's not just that, well, everything was okay, and then we had this guy Trump that was elected for some crazy reason because he was a very effective demagogue. I think the point I was trying to make is that Trump grew out of the conditions of globalization, of liberalism, right? That was really the key point. In a sense, not just the Democratic Party, but the traditional Democratic and Republican parties, the Bushes and the Clintons and so forth, they prepared the ground, just like a gardener prepares the ground for planting. They prepared the ground and planted the seeds of Trumpism, and Trumpism is what's growing. And there's no way back to the old system. Anyway, kind of gone on too long, but go ahead.
Okay, Sharon Rose is next, followed by Norma Harrison and then Jean Rule.
Thank you very much, Alan. I have a couple of comments and then a question. My first comment is that in addition to the recommended readings that you had at the end, I would suggest that people might want to read Marx's speech on tariffs, which he on free trade, which he delivered in January of 1848, and which 40 years later Engels wrote an excellent introduction to. So both the speech and the introduction to it, I would highly recommend. They have in the past been published in books with the Poverty of Philosophy that Marx wrote just a few months before he gave the speech, and you can find those books, or it's online. Those two speeches, those two things are online. I wanted to say about the US dollar as the world currency. The Chinese have been leading for quite a while now with the idea that what should be the world currency is some kind of basket of currencies, a combined basis for trade in more than just dollars. And they have not been able to establish that, but they're still working on it and with BRICS, expansion of BRICS, and it might be on the agenda. Who knows? My question is similar to what Mehmet asked, but more I guess fundamental. I'm trying to understand which part of capital is behind Trump, favors what he's putting forward, because it seems to me that U.S. capital as a whole doesn't really care about trade deficits, and they make their billions. And in the current system of trade, so they don't necessarily care that there's deindustrialization. In fact, they created it by shipping, so-called shipping jobs overseas. So can you comment on that question? Thank you.
Sure. Just a couple of quick comments. I think it is worth looking at that speech that Marx gave, and actually Engels wrote a preface to one of the publications where he presented the ideas in that speech. But the one thing that I would say is that the speech was given under very different historical conditions, where it was basically the tail end of the feudal system, and Marx was discussing the position of the trade union movement on tariffs being used to protect feudal remnants, and he saw it as progressive to advance the development of capitalism. Today, we're in a kind of a decrepit, a moribund economic system of imperialism, and the debate, the factors of free trade and tariffs is really a very different debate. In terms of your question, the second part of your question, could you say it again real quickly?
Which part of capital is
it
Trump
behind?
represent? Because they don't really care about trade deficits.
Okay.
Okay. Sorry.
Yeah, I have to answer that honestly. I'm kind of puzzled to a great extent about this. Let me just say that if you look at if you go out into the mainstream of the media, at least, and really even politics, the wave is so strong in condemning these economic policies that it kind of makes me wonder. I really don't have a handle on how the capitalist class is divided, which sections are supporting it or not. In terms of your description of the situation, I think you're absolutely right. I think the largest section, or a large section of the capitalist class, is saying, hey, what are you doing, buddy? Hands off, right? Hands off imperialism. Imperialism is working just fine, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, it's kind of interesting, everybody. I want to address this to the audience, but my impression is that everybody's talking about the Trump madness and the Trump insanity and so forth. But in some ways, the Trump phenomenon represents a more grounded and realistic understanding of the problems of the capitalist system, because whereas the other side is saying, hey, no problem, everything is fine, and that's why they're losing the election, and the right wing is growing. Trump is saying, hey, we have a problem. We need to address this. And for example, the military-industrial part, they can't fight a war. They can't produce they can fight the war, but they can't produce the military-industrial hardware and production that they need to successfully fight these wars. So obviously Trump's solutions are madness, absolute madness, and it's probably going to hasten the demise of the system. That's why he's being criticized. But at the same time, the other side is saying, hey, it's no problem, let's just go on, let's keep going. And in fact, I think the emergence of Trump is a reflection of the fact that these problems are real. And in many ways, the liberal globalists, they're the ones that are totally out of touch with reality. You know, Trump may get booted out, you know, the midterm election, this is going to cause so much disruption. But the dissatisfaction that people are experiencing, the population is experiencing as a result of the way capitalism has evolved in the 21st century, that's not going away. And if anything, I think, you know, people are talking about, well, we have fascism now. Wait till it shifts back the other way. And we, you know, this is when we're going to really see more of a, you know, things going out of control and more of a grassroots push towards fascism and repression. So I think we need to do a program on what you're saying with a political scientist.
Okay, thank you. Actually, I would like to go to Citizen of the Planet before I go to Norma. Norma, please be patient. Citizen of the Planet, you go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much, Raj. So I wouldn't have been so anxious about where I fell in line, except as I mentioned in the chat, I have a subsequent engagement to go to. So Allan, I certainly also very much enjoyed your talk, and I look very much forward to enjoying it again when it's posted. Please give me a 30 seconds heads up as opposed to 15 seconds heads up, timekeeper. So Allan, correct me anywhere you think that I'm wrong. I think you said that while the Democrats are talking about trans issues or issues like that, the Republicans are talking about reindustrialization. And I would say that, of course, that's not entirely true. The Republicans spend a lot of time talking about anti-trans issues and other demagoguery.
Yeah.
And I would say, as other people may have said, not necessarily attending this session, that the Democrats were talking about these so-called woke issues to the extent that they were because they weren't delivering on anything else. And so that's all they had left to talk about. My question, my questions that I'll interlace with other comments. You, as I understood it, you seem to be talking about Trump is going to decrease the deficit, if I understood that correctly, or at least that's what he says he's going to do. But he also says he's going to spend $1 trillion on the military, and that's certainly not going to decrease the deficit. If he follows his pattern, we know he's going to give his mega rich friends huge tax breaks. That's not going to decrease the budget. Unless he breaks with aid to Israel.
30 seconds. 30 seconds.
He's going to give billions to Israel, tens of billions to Israel. That's not going to decrease the budget. So I will say in my remaining time, this phenomenon of Trump is very interesting. A lot of you leftists probably don't watch a lot of TV, and I just watch my fair amount. But it has been at least 25 years of the media building up Trump. I'm surprised how far back it goes when I come across re-aired sitcoms that when I'm flipping channels and find out that sitcoms 20 years ago were like building up Trump in addition to Barbara Walters and, you know, these reality shows. So that's quite a phenomenon about the base that the media has given him so that, you know, an egomaniac like Trump can decide, hey, I'm so well known and so well loved that I'm going to run for president. Thank you.
Okay, just a quick comment in response to your comment. You're absolutely right about this deficit solution that they've come up with. It's insanity to the nth degree. Because number one, what are we doing? We're going to increase military spending to $1 trillion. Number two, we're going to extend the tax cuts of another in the upcoming period. He's giving tax cuts, an extension of the tax cuts that he gave during his first term. And this problem of deficit and debt, I mean, the idea is, Citizen One, that somehow these tariffs, which are a form, as I said in my presentation, a form of revenue, a source of revenue for the US, that we're going to unleash business, capitalist enterprise to such a great extent. It's going to be so wonderful and beautiful to sort of imitate his mode of talking, that it's going to compensate for all this. It's absolutely insane. I think what we're seeing here is the acceleration of this process of degeneration. It's kind of funny, but I saw a short YouTube video by this guy, Peter Schiff, who's kind of a libertarian critic of capitalism. He's a very right-wing libertarian critic. And he's been talking about this crisis that's been going on for many, many years. He's actually one of the leading voices of how bad things are. And he was sort of scratching his head. He was saying, you know something? I always thought the system was going to come down on the basis of external forces, but he says, now I think it's going to come down on the basis of internal forces. So it's like what's going to pop the bubble is happening inside. So you're absolutely right. It's insanity.
Okay, thank you. Norma, you're next, please. Go ahead.
Yeah. Hi, everybody. Too much thinking going on here. We have a lot of subsidization of governmental programs, of programs to try to maintain an appearance that we're getting along. We're not getting along, not without government subsidy. So isn't it possible, no, possible, everything's possible. Isn't it a good thing to think of us taking over those tax-paid, American tax-paid programs that are subsidized, that we somehow find the way to control them as steps to naming that they are socialists and extending them, that they could belong to us instead of just to a vague government that we don't have a handle on, and we're not calling what it is. There's a lot of stuff, and it's not something we've been able to utilize in our advancement of our intentions.
You know something, Norma, I think that what you're touching on is really such the key question here, which is, and I think what you're really getting into is a question of how do we go about politically building a movement that can somehow solve this problem. And that's something that, boy, I have to say for me is a real puzzler in many ways.
What
And
we
I can,
have to do, what we have
Go
to
ahead.
do is tell the news writers in the daily papers, look at this, it's government supported. Look at this, it's government supported. This belongs to us. We want to help run it. We want to make a setup where we can help control it, something like that.
Well, I mean, I think what you're really talking about are as an example of what we would call transitional demands that we want to make. I don't think we would be telling the capitalist media about this because they're not going to cover us anyway, but we should be talking to working people
Someplace,
and
yeah,
talking to
well-
them about things like, for example, people might not know this, but during the Great Depression, the WPA employed 15 million people. You know, that 15 million today would be about 10% of our workforce. It was a lot more back then. Now, I'm talking about or the banking system, that we should have some way of nationalizing the banking system in order to remove this parasitic. Now, this is not good. Wait, hang on, Norma. Let me try to finish. We're not going to achieve socialism on the basis of these incremental demands, but the kind of incremental demands that we can place on the capitalist class that would make a lot of sense to people who are struggling to survive under the conditions that we have in the country today, that we can use this as a way to bring the idea of socialism to people, that, hey, we can take control of our resources. In addition to that, we also should be pointing out that a lot of these structures that you're describing are actually the basis for a segment of the population that supports capitalism by basically providing small, Band-Aid solutions to problems that are becoming untenable. So anyway,
Yeah,
that's
occupy.
Okay, let's move.
Occupy.
Let's move forward because I have quite a few hands. Thank you, Norma. So the next person, actually I have to go by sequence, and I was not correct previously. So Janet is next, followed by Kim's iPad, then Eugene, then Judith, followed by Polina and Kit Kat. So that's the sequence. Remind me if I make a mistake there. So Janet, you're next, please.
Okay, thank you. A few comments and two quick questions. It's my understanding that America won't be able to build factories and an industrial manufacturing infrastructure fast enough and isn't producing enough basic materials like steel to do so. And aside from relying on trade with China, the US still depends on imports from the West neo-colonized countries in Africa. I also understand that investors do not want to do business in an unstable and uncertain economic environment, which is what Trump's constant seesawing edicts produces. Another thing that is happening that's contributing to all of this is the cutting of government jobs and the hollowing out of social services inside the US, most notably via DOGE, making Americans more desperate and will force them to work for lower wages if they can find a job. Anyway, my two questions are, Allan, you had a slide about global commodities. Are you using this term as an equivalent to natural resources? Global commodity. It looked like from the listing that's what that was. The other question is, when you started the presentation, I heard you say that it all started 42 years ago. Perhaps I misheard, but if not, what in particular were you referring to that happened in 1983?
Okay, just a quick response. In terms of what I was talking about at the very, very beginning, I was making reference to Francis Fukuyama's book, The End of History, where in response to the, it was 1992, I think it was, when that book was published. So maybe I miscalculated the years. But basically, this was the high point of triumphalism of the capitalist class when the Soviet Union was demised. They said we had fascism, we had communism. Now we're going to have liberal democracy, and basically what's happened since then is that liberal globalism has come back to bite them in the rear end, and that's what we're seeing today. In terms of commodities, very good observation. The interesting thing is that obviously China is manufacturing most of what they're consuming in terms of manufactured products, right? So they're really not importing. They have a tremendous balance of trade surplus. And so what I was showing were the commodities that were being imported by China, and it is really at the category of raw materials that we're talking about, because they're the world's workshop right now. And so you're absolutely right that I should have said, well, production inputs, commodities, make that clearer.
Thank you, Janet and Allan. Now we're going to go to Kim Ang's iPad, please. Please unmute yourself and ask the question. You have 2 minutes.
Okay, thank you. I was very interested in your last point about what is to be done. And my question has always been, why is there no socialist revolution in advanced capitalist countries? And then the other thing is that the global spread of capitalism gives a tremendous power to imperialism and its ability to repress, assassinate, and bribe resistance, and the ideological corruption of a large stratum of the US upper middle class, right? Which leads to social democracy and the gradual, and people seeing gradual change through elections. So for me, it's not, at least in my idea, it's not possible to radically overthrow this system without tight connections with the global majority, and changing this mindset of gradual change to actual revolution. So the question is the weakness of the left. Why is the left in the US so weak? So those are some of my questions when you raise the thing about what is to be done, because during the time of Lenin, what is to be done is we have moved so far ahead. And no doubt in a lot of people's mind, US capitalism, imperialism is so moribund and so decayed that it's gone to the point of no redemption. Thank you.
You're making absolutely tremendous points, very, very essential. And let me try to put it in some context in terms of my thinking. It's getting a little bit outside my expertise and my topic of presentation, but this infrastructure that you're referring to that has served as the basis for the maintenance or the continuation of capitalism has been built up for it's been going since the beginning of capitalism, but in the US in particular for the 80 years since the end of the war. So the US, has been able to, in the early part of the post-war period, use increased profitability through the monopolization of manufacturing to stabilize the class relationships between workers and the capitalist class. So you had the rise of the real wage, you had a highly regulated class struggle with labor laws and things like that. And you also had the building up of the infrastructure in terms of education and media. And all of this was financed in large part or through, and this is something I'm really interested in, through this flow of funds that were coming in from overseas, a great deal from the global South. What's happening today is that's being undermined. That is being undermined. And I think, Kim, what you're really getting into is the most important question for us, which is that the way the class struggle is manifesting itself in the world today is that we have this rise of China, this rise of Russia, this rise of the global South. And it's taking place to a great extent at the level of national contradictions. So this sort of resistance movement, the Palestinians, et cetera, in the Middle East. And this is what we have this happening on the one hand. On the other hand, this structure that was built up in the post-war period that involved quote unquote bribery and being able to pad the machine to mitigate the class struggle is falling apart. I believe that what this is going to lead to, I think there's a lot of people in the international communist movement who would say the same thing, is that that's why we support this process of the rise of China, the rise of Russia, the rise of BRICS, because right now, this is the way the class struggle is going to unfold in the interests of the working class internationally. And you can see that the class contradictions within the advanced capitalist countries are intensifying. And you have political upheaval. Now, we don't have like a mass waves of strikes and things like that, to the level that we had when we had an industrial working class in the 30s. But I think you can see that this rising tide of resistance of countries claiming their sovereignty is really, the undermining of the financial system that was used to squeeze countries, like Cuba, to put sanctions on them, is being undermined. These are the conditions that we've got to make use of today. And this whole structure of accommodation and liberalism is really dead in the US. If you look at Bernie Sanders and AOC, none of this stuff is gonna take place. It's not gonna happen. It's sort of like a way of sort of diverting people from what's really going on and holding up the hope that we can go back to the 50s and 60s. And that train left the station a long time ago. Very good point. I want to see some more on that.
Okay, we are 12:29, but session started late. So I think I can stretch it from my side the maximum 15 minutes to cover as many people as possible. Eugene is next, followed by Judith Osterman. Eugene Rule, please go ahead.
Okay, well, Alan, thanks a lot. This was a great talk, great topic. But when you talked about tariffs and trade and all that, my mind goes back to November, the Seattle WTO protests, November 30th, 1999. I had the good fortune to be there, and it was really a fluorescence of radical thought, of people coming together to oppose this kind of action there. And, one of the slogans was Teamsters and Turtles together at last, meaning the environmental movement and the working class movement got together. And that was really inspiring. And it kind of did led to massive protests and a new kind of movement that came out of that, which lasted until the attack on 9/11, which many people feel was an inside job, but that cut short any kind of protests after that. But I just wonder, any comments on this whole occasion and how to move forward and the actions of Seattle in 1999?
Boy, that's another a good political question. It's kind of interesting. I think everybody here has noticed that, for example, the UAW has come out in support of the tariffs. With some, they didn't support Trump in the election, I believe, but one of the slides that I showed actually showed a UAW worker, and I think the leader, they've basically complimented Trump in terms of protection. And I think that what that kind of represents at this stage, things have developed so much since those years in Seattle, is that the labor aristocracy, the trade union leadership has been just has degenerated so much, has shrunk 7%, that basically a lot of them are trying to sort of stake out their position and protect it in the bureaucracy, and they see it's amazing the extent to which some of them have kind of gone over to Trump. So I think that the question is, we've got to look at, well, what is the class relations today, and how should we regard allies, and also how shall we target people that are against us? And I think it's going to be it's an important question that needs to be analyzed. So it's a lot more complicated today than I think it was even 40 years ago, 45 years ago.
Thank you, Alan. Judith Osterman is next, followed by Polina Vasiliev. Judith, please go ahead.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Comrade Dr. Allen. Okay. So recently, it was a terrorist attack in Kashmir, and India and Pakistan are going together, and they're tremendous hotheads. And so I don't know if this is actually going to break out into a military conflict or not. But at any rate, what I wanted to say was that, in my opinion, I have no evidence for this, the United States was behind this. And this is the American MO, to foster terrorists and to get them to create conflicts among countries that should be allies. India is an important member of the BRICS, and this could potentially weaken the BRICS. Okay, so what I wanted to say was, I want your opinion on this. I've recently been following Brian Berletic, and even though he's not a communist or a socialist, he is an excellent analyst of imperialism. So he thinks that everything that the Trump administration is doing, which he says is just basically a continuation of the previous administrations, everything that they're doing is in order to vanquish the threats to American global domination, and primarily the threat from China, also Russia, the BRICS, and Iran. and he says that 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 Trump has no intention of stopping the conflict in the Ukraine. He's throwing it to the Europeans, and they're putting up solutions that the Russians definitely won't go along with, and the idea is to tie Russia up.
Okay.
Thank you. To tie Russia up so that when Israel attacks Iran, they won't be able to help. Okay, so as far as the tariffs go, he thinks that they're being used basically to create economic instability in the European and other allies, as well as other countries, and these countries will all look to China for cheap goods.
Judith, please, that's enough. Let Allan respond because we're short of time. Thank you.
Okay, all right.
Very, very briefly, I can't comment on the Kashmir crisis. I think we'll probably have to do something pretty quickly about that. Big topic. I've been following it, and it is very concerning. As far as other things, one of the things about this that's really quite interesting is how everybody, I talked a lot about how the rise of China has sort of really upset the imperial order. But certainly the Ukraine war has been perhaps the most important factor in terms of upsetting. This has thrown everything up in the air because this was supposed to be a great victory for the globalists, and it's turned into probably the greatest setback and defeat for globalism in the 21st century. So that's really the extent that I can kind of get into that. And it's really kind of upsetting the apple cart in terms of the relations between the U.S. and its European allies and the class struggle in Europe. So it's getting into the politics that I have a hard time addressing.
Okay. Polina Vasiliev, please go ahead.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank Allan for an excellent presentation. I really don't have a I don't have a specific question. My previous questions have been answered, actually. I wanted to bring up the topic of supporting ICSS again. And for those of us who would like to make monthly donations and would rather not pay the Patreon fees or the Buy Me a Coffee fees, is there a way to set it up, say, by PayPal? I think PayPal may not be charging, or maybe even Zelle. Could you let us know in the chat or if possibly on the stream so that those who will be watching on YouTube, I encourage everybody to donate and give us some more ways of doing that. Thanks.
Thank you, Polina.
Okay. So after that is Kit Vac, and then we have Mary Gao as the last one. We won't be able to go to second round, please. Sorry about that.
Okay.
Go ahead.
I think I took my hand down, but I'll go ahead and see if Allan can comment on the parasitic nature of today's coupon clippers. I know that you talked about the intensification, and I think there's a lot of people still scrambling to the stock market and cryptocurrency and all that to try to make as much money as they can because they do see the economy is going down. Anyway, it was interesting that I went to a conference last week where a lot of young people who are involved in AI development are so pro-capitalist and unaware of the whole international situation in the economy. I see those places as an opportunity for us to interact with panels and such that try to promote capitalism. And there was a voice, distinct voice for peace and demilitarization on a panel that I attended last weekend. So I think there's some openness for that, but there's so much education that needs to take place. Anyway, I had a question about this parasitic nature. I was wondering if you could comment a little bit more on this. Thank you. And excellent presentation, Allan.
Oh, thank you. The parasitism it's the more you look into it, just it's so unbelievable. I mean, what they're doing today is, in addition to the quadrillion dollars in funds that are involved in the derivatives market, there's actually been a new market that has emerged where they're taking the investments in private equity funds and packaging them up in the same type of securities that that triggered the 2008 crisis. There hasn't been a lot of reporting on this in the financial news. It's, I think the thing that we have to keep in mind is that when a capitalist class cannot engage in accumulation, or engages in accumulation where it favors, and they're able to carry out speculation versus actual production to produce the goods that we need and services that we need, then it'll go that way. And it's very clear. I don't think there's any question whatsoever the nature of this kind of speculative finance that's taking place, the things that Marx had talked about even back in the days of capital.
Okay, thank you. Mary Gao, you are the last one, after which we'll end the session. Thank you.
Yeah, hi. I just wanted to, anyway, I'm borrowing my wife's account.
That's fine. That's fine. Just introduce your name so we know your name.
In any case, I just wanted to put in my 2 cents today, and echoing what Lucy said a while back, that this presentation by Allan Miller was very good. I want to say it's this kind of presentation, which is a Marxist-Leninist presentation. Allan, you are a true Marxist-Leninist, and the kind of insight that you have put into this understanding of how capitalism works, and also a little bit on how socialism works, have contributed to our understanding, and it should be contributed to spreading out to the working class in the United States, and that's why it's a poorly needed Communist Party that needs to put all this together that Allan has just presented today, and bring it to the class. It's like Lenin said, that the intelligentsia class is the class that has to bring this kind of understanding to the working class, even though they know what is happening, but they need it to be put into a precise understanding so that their consciousness is raised and take action in defeating and throwing away this capitalist evil system. And I think, Allan, that you have definitely contributed to this, and I wanted to commend you, and maybe you should write a book, because this is precisely what the whole world needs. Thank you very much.
2 minutes. Thank you.
Go ahead, Allan, your response. And
Yeah,
then we'll
thank you.
finish.
This will be my last comment. I want to thank you. What you just said was really going to be my part 4 of my presentation. And this is exactly the kind of thing I think we need to be thinking about. We need to really develop our narrative, the kinds of things that we've been talking about during the Q&A, and really talk about what we need to provide a renaissance, or true renaissance, for working people, and stability and prosperity for people in this country, and to solve our problems. And I absolutely agree with you that this is going to involve a political struggle we've got to really take into hand the challenge of a workers' party, of a party to represent a communist party that represents the interests of the working class. There's a lot going on out there related to this right now. And I think that the ICSS, the last thing I'm going to say is we should do a session on this and really talk about the state of the left, and in particular, I would say the communist left, the Marxist-Leninist left. I'd love to hear discussion on that. So thank you very much. Next time I will contact you, and you can write the last part of my presentation. Appreciate it.
Okay, well, this is a fantastic thing, the exchange to end the session. Thank you, everybody, for participating. Remember, the next week's session is an exciting session with Brian Wilson and Jerry Condon. So we'll see you next week. And with that, we're ending this presentation today.
Institute for the Critical Study of Society at the Nebo Proctor Marxist Library receives no corporate funding, nor do we have any paid staff. We rely on the support of working class folks that share our commitment to the socialist legacy of Karl Marx. We continue to need funds to meet necessary expenses. Since we can no longer pass the hat at our in-person forums, please send contributions to our treasurer, either online via PayPal or by check. The PayPal ID is ICSS Sunday, SUNDAY, @yahoo.com, and the name is Richard Fallenbaum. And checks may be made out to Richard Fallenbaum and sent to him at 1225 Nielsen Street, Berkeley, California, 94706. Fallenbaum is spelled Fallenbaum. To donate directly to the Marxist Library, send a check to the Nebo Proctor Marxist Library at 6501 Telegraph Avenue, Oakland, California, 94609, or directly or donate online at www.paypal.me/npml. For information, write to npml at marxistlibr.org, and the website is marxistlibr.org.